Okay. All right, yes. So through our conversation, guys, we have kind of taken care of a lot of aspects of my first bullet point here of defining sustainable ag and just describing some production practices. So what I want to do is just kind of move through that a little quickly and just show you guys some examples of production practices and maybe explain why we do what we do and why they're sustainable. We'll talk a little bit, I suspect maybe as community health workers, you guys are particularly interested in some of the data I have here about the relationship between production system and food nutrition, food safety, food nutrition, things of that nature. And then time permitting, when we talk about sustainable agriculture and food security, I always like to just expose people, if you haven't heard of Norman Borlaug, to just talk a little bit about his work in the Green Revolution and kind of bring this up from a local scale to a global scale. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. And I'll reiterate, this is y'all's deal. So if you have questions,
there we go.
have to hold your tongue just right.
Is it working?
Yes.
Awesome. Yes.
Sustainable? What do you guys think?
I would say yes.
Yes.
But I don't know. I'm not the expert.
So a lot of people have this notion, right, that if you're spraying synthetic pesticides, automatically you're bad for the planet.
Oh, that's what they're doing.
Yes, yeah. So these guys are spraying, looking at the growth stage, probably a fungicide on that wheat crop. Okay, so if we want to keep all of these leaves healthy so that we can produce a yield, we have to do something to control the pathogens. And farmers do a lot of things at planting, culturally, so how they plant, when they plant, how they rotate crops to try to manage diseases. But in the cereal grains, one of the most important types of diseases is called the rusts. And so they literally blow in on the wind. So unless you have genetic resistance, you're going to be using fungicides to protect your plants in bad years. A lot of people automatically assume that a picture like this would be sustainable, right? Because these guys are using all natural methods of weed control in this particular picture.
And are they pulling weeds? Is that what they're doing?
You can't do that on a large scale.
Yeah.
One of my experiences fresh out of
My
grad school.
parents said when I was little.
I know.
That's what I'm saying. My sunbathing in high school was pulling weeds in the garden.
Yeah.
Now, but here's the thing. These ladies are hand hoeing some weeds out of this cotton crop. You guys, this might be more sustainable for them because that might be the best technology they have.
Right.
Okay, so it's different from one system to the next. Irrigation. A lot of people think, ag is the #1 user for water on the planet. We use something like 80% of the water on the planet, most of it through crop irrigation.
But it's dispersed, so they're probably not using as much as if I was standing out with a hose.
Exactly where I'm going. We have gotten so much better at how efficiently we use water. So for example, 30 years ago, this water would have been shooting up into the air just like your lawn sprinkler. How much do we lose to evaporation through that process? How much goes off site through that process?
Or drip irrigation.
Or drip irrigation is the most efficient way in terms of water use. Right there, drip irrigation. There you go. Drip irrigation, right? So take it again back to that kind of global developing country perspective. They made drip irrigation just by putting some water in a bucket and connecting it to some tubes. So fantastic, right? Low input, but it works. All right, here's what I was telling you guys about the definition of SUSAG. Economics, environment, and community, or socially acceptable, okay? So the USDA defines sustainable ag as addressing sustainability and the ability to produce long-term in each of these 3 areas, okay? So you guys have a pretty good idea of what environmental component looks like. Economics, never ever forget that ag farming is a business. When my dad makes decisions on his farm, it's based on what he thinks is going to make him enough money to stay in business next year, okay? And then socially acceptable. So this is where some of this idea of providing jobs for your community, giving back to your community, so sponsoring that little league team, things of that nature, all go into socially acceptable. Okay. Okay, so our 3 categories here, what things do we look for? Biodiversity, soil health. We've talked about soil health. We've talked about water use. clearly profitability, and this notion of self-sufficient. Did your name tag say Bob?
Yes, that's Bob.
Okay, so this notion of self-sufficiency that Bob mentioned earlier about reducing off-farm inputs and then making contributions to the local economy. And those are some indicators. All right, now here's where I wanted to kind of slow down a little bit. Practices that are sustainable. Here's a list: diversification, reduced tillage, cover crops, judicious use of fertilizers. I was just reading a paper earlier this morning that something like 17% of the fertilizer we apply is actually consumed by people. So like 83% is either held in the biomass that we don't consume or lost to the environment. IPM, integrated pest management. So, I mentioned using cultural practices like when and how we plant to manage diseases, things of that nature. Rotational grazing, direct marketing. So I've got some pictures. Diversification could look like crop rotations. You mentioned crop rotations earlier. So just growing a different crop in the same location each year. Diversification might mean integrating livestock into your system. There's some evidence that suggests that adding animals helps that process of cycling nutrients through the environment, okay? Or then this would be an example of intercropping. So they planted probably some cowpeas, would be my guess, with some corn, right? So you've got a leguminous crop that can capture atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into nitrogen that the plants and other soil organisms can use.
How does that work when the corn outgrows and then the peas don't get the sunlight?
So you're gonna plant these in wider rows so that doesn't happen. That corn is probably not gonna get any wider. It'll continue to get taller, but at that growth state, it's not gonna get a whole lot wider. The big problem here in the US with intercropping is harvest.
Right, trying to get the equipment down.
Right, because when you harvest your corn, you're gonna run over your beans, or vice versa. So it works better in smallholder types of situations in developing countries and home gardens, community gardens, that kind of thing. And then reduced tillage. So tillage historically has been not only important for adequate seedbed preparation, so making sure that we have good ground to put those seeds into so they come up quickly and healthy, but it's also important for pest control, right? Weed management is one of the #1 reasons why we till, okay? And in fact, when you talk about herbicide-resistant weeds, I hate the term super weeds, by the way. If somebody tells you that they're super weeds, tell them they're wrong. Because the herbicides don't change the weeds. I'm totally chasing a rabbit here. The herbicides don't change the weeds. They are a selection pressure. Same type of selection pressure you apply every time you mow your grass, right? The dandelions are the weeds that survive because they grow low to the ground. Or they adapt and they change, right? The population that you select for are ones that grow low to the ground. Same idea, just a different selection for sure. So conventional tillage is super important for weed management. A lot of folks will tell you that Roundup Ready crops are the reason we have seen such an increase in conservation tillage practices, because they allowed weed control relatively inexpensively and efficiently in production systems. And so the reason we want conservation tillage is not only because we're leaving the residue on the surface of the soil, we are also stopping soil erosion. Okay, that's the #1 benefit of conservation tillage.
So it doesn't blow away or rain away.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
basically mulching back in.
That you're leaving that.
What are they using?
Okay, so all of this stuff on this field is what was left over after they harvested last year's corn crop. So they don't till it back in. So historically, farmers would have come in and tilled that in the fall. And then it degrades faster and it's not on the surface to protect from raindrop impact or wind. So conservation tillage. And so it could be completely eliminating tillage, or it could be that you only till like once before you plant. So just reduced tillage. So it could look either way.
So instead of doing it in the fall and then having to come back again in the spring because everything's tightened up and hardened up.
Exactly. You just do it once right before you plant. And so they changed the way they make or manufacture tillage implements to facilitate some of that. I'm gonna have to stand on my head here, you guys. Can I do it over here?
Just use like 2 fingers.
Oh,
there we go.
There we go.
Oh, but where did I go?
Two
That's not
fingers.
where we're supposed to go.
Skipped one.
Well, no, it's just hard to.
I don't know where that slide came from, but this is where we're supposed to be, I think.
Good.
You guys had the concept of rotational grazing. So instead of letting animals have access to an entire pasture, you divide it up into sections. And you have the animals, so basically in a grazing system, the cattle are your harvesting machines, okay? So you divide it up so that they harvest one area uniformly, and then you give them a new area to harvest uniformly, and then you give them a new area. And hopefully at some point you get back around, now the first area has regrown, and you let them back on that. It maintains higher forage quality. So in these types of production systems, you tend to get higher cattle performance.
But hey, it's easier said than done with the drought.
Drought affects it. You need a lot more land, but you're going to need more land anyway if you're rotationally grazing.
Because I mean, we've
Hey, Rhonda, can you mute, please?
we rotation.
Okay.
Like yeah, there's not much grass. So since September, we've been feeding hay.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's easier said than done when the drought hits.
So, agriculture is so dependent on the weather.
Yes.
One of the biggest kind of resistances to rotational grazing that producers have is it's just a lot more management. You got to be out there measuring or checking pastures and moving cattle and building fence, and it's just a lot more management. And then these are my chicken tractors.
Oh, yeah.
Chicken tractors. So
Yeah.
in a lot of the lower input kind of organic pasture systems, they will make these little mobile cages, and they'll let the birds go in and scavenge for bugs or the corn that passed through the cattle that didn't get broken down.
Yeah, plus,
And so they're adding fertilizer.
And goats are good rotational grazing.
And so goats have a different food preference than cattle, right? So you can use goats actually to help manage brush in your pastures. If you've got good enough fences.
This machine is not recording.
It doesn't
It's-
affect them.
No, it doesn't
Her
affect
machine is
them, and they
recording.
love
Her
it.
account is recording.
Huh.
Because whatever
I didn't
she
know that
wants
they-
to run with,
Weren't susceptible to your assault.
So that means I'm not recording her at all.
not from this machine. It is recording,
maybe more
but
in the
it's not
corner.
from this workstation.
I don't know. It worked over there earlier.
Oh,
There, it's bigger.
big.
So
Oh,
There.
okay.
it's wrong.
There we go. Man.
So the question a lot of people have is organic ag sustainable? Because a lot of times, the advertising for organically produced products is that we're more
The recording
sustainable
regardless.
than
Don't worry about
conventionally
that.
produced products,
We need to
right?
do
I'm sure
once
you've
this
heard that.
session's over,
Right.
you launch your
Um,
account and test it.
Not necessarily.
So how will we get the recording?
Always
I can
true.
record it, 'cause that-
So is organic ag sustainable? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what you're growing and what kind of price you can get for it, right? That
Yeah, it's
economic
recorded,
squeeze.
so it'll be fine.
It depends
Whenever
on,
This session.
do we think about yield per acre? Or do we think about inputs per acre? You can have lower inputs, but you're also gonna have lower yields. And there's a philosophy that suggests that we can do a better job of conservation as an earth if we maximize production on the acres that we're tilling now, instead of continuing to expand the acres that we use. Right, so now we can have set aside area for conservation or preservation purposes because we've maximized production. So we talk about sustainable intensification. When you hear that term, that's what people are talking about.
So you're talking about organic agriculture, not using pesticides.
Your next
So
one
it's
is
a
one.
one thing.
Yeah.
Once this one, 12:45.
Is there an advancer or are my fingers the only tool that I have?
That I can do.
All right, so when I say organic agriculture, I'm talking about systems that are certified organic by the USDA. Okay, here's the definition of organic agriculture. Okay, and I'll let you guys read that there. You don't need me to read those words. So one of the things I want to point out about this is that there is nothing in that definition about community, and there is nothing in that definition about economics. So can an organic system be sustainable? Yes. But if you, just because you're meeting the requirements of an organic system, that doesn't mean that you're sustainable. Okay. I think a lot of people get caught in this trap of assuming that because
You should just get it.
There we go. Because it's organic, it's sustainable. So in order to produce organically, you have to undergo extensive inspections, you have to keep records. You can't get certified organic until you've had 3 years of production without pesticides. So if you have land that has never been used for agriculture before, and you know there's no pesticides there, yes, that can go ahead, year 1, be organic. But if you're converting existing farmland, you have to grow for 3 years without pesticides
To get it out of the soil.
before you can be certified organic. So there's a truckload of rules for everything. And some of them, from a scientific perspective, don't make a ton of sense. Like I said, just because the chemical isn't made in a factory doesn't mean that it's less harmful for me or for the environment. So again, as community health workers, you're going out with people, you want people to know what labels mean, right? So when you're going through the grocery store, foods that carry this logo are foods that have been certified organic by the USDA. They've undergone that inspection process. They've got vigorous records of their property, okay? But that logo can be used on these 3 products, okay? You might have something that is 100% organic. So organically grown apples would be a good example. You might have something that is certified organic, so that you can see they're 95 to 99% organic ingredients. So, maybe applesauce that they've added ascorbic acid, vitamin C to, that might be certified organic. And then you can have made with organic ingredients. Okay, so maybe that's your apple chips that now we've got oil that we fried them in that may or may not be organic, and other preservatives or flavorings or what have you. Okay, so there's 3 different levels there. Just so you're aware, so you know what you're getting. You can also, if you're interested in doing so, purchase foods that just list organic ingredients as organic in the ingredient list.
Okay.
So sometimes you'll see like organic beet sugar.
It'll say organic in front of it.
That's how they'll identify it. Okay. So just because it has a label doesn't mean that it's all organic. Now here's a slide that the way they set up these figures is a little complicated. So let me break it down for you a little bit. This information comes from a group out of the University of Minnesota. And actually, I've got a video link at the end of this that if Payre has shared the presentation with you guys, you can have that video link. It's by the same group, and it talks about sustainable ag. It's good. It's a TED Talk, if you're familiar with those.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the way this works is this solid line here at the number 1 in each of those graphs indicates that if the data points were on that line, the organic yield would be equal to the conventional yield. Okay. If it's less than 1, that means the organic yield is less than the conventional yield. If it's greater than 1, that would mean organic yield was more than the conventional yield. Okay. So if you look, all of these data points, no matter how they sliced and diced all the research projects, whether they were looking at different types of crops, whether they were looking at leguminous crops or non-leguminous crops, annual crops or perennial crops, or specific cropping systems, corn, barley, wheat, tomatoes, soybeans, all of those data points are to the left of the number 1. So no matter what system they looked at, organic yields were consistently less than conventional production yields. Okay, caveat here, statistics, right? So here's the range of certainty. So some of them, the range of uncertainty goes beyond 1 to 1. But the average data point,
If it's on that side, then it means
Organic
that
is
the
better.
organic is better on that spectrum. Okay.
So for example, on corn, there's a pretty tight variation there.
But it's still better on the,
It's still better for conventional. The yields are greater in conventional
Okay,
production.
so they're not able to see your slides.
Oh
They were.
Oh, the little picture things are gone on the.
no. Oh, they did. They just
on
went
the left
away.
edge.
They were there until just a minute ago. And that looks different too.
I am so sorry. I just had somebody in here.
It's been like this all morning.
It was like this last week too. I'm about ready to cry and go home. I
You've
don't know
never
what else
had
to
this
do.
much trouble. Taylor, you're bad luck.
ever since we got this.
Ever
thing
since the
added into
TV
the-
has come in, it has messed everything up.
Yeah.
I just came along to listen because I enjoyed listening to you.
Oh, thanks, Taylor.
Aw.
And I don't. I don't know what to do. I guess we'll just let you just go on and talk, and I will send the slides, and that's all I know to do.
Can you email the slides?
I can email the slides.
right now, and then they can they pull them up on their own?
Yeah, give me just a second. Let me think
Just
here.
a thought,
Taylor?
not that it's the best thought, but it's a
No,
thought.
but it's a good thought. Hey, Taylor, can you come here and
Yeah.
do that?
I'm almost scared to shut.
I'm almost scared to get up there. I'm almost scared to get up there.
So the moral of the story is that data sets, so when we look at all of the research and we pull everybody's research together and we start looking at averages across all the research, organic yields less than conventional.
Share your screen.
And is that large scale, I guess, agriculture, or does that compare with down to
No.
garden, community garden?
So this would
Stop
be
share.
research plots.
Oh,
Okay.
stop
I think they
share.
might be able to,
Share screen.
they were back.
Share.
Okay.
So basically what they're
This.
saying is on this amount of land, if we didn't use any
Can you see anything now?
pesticides
Remotes?
or anything, we can only
No.
produce this much, but then on the same amount.
Yes, I can.
Awesome.
disease and stuff, you can get 2
Okay.
times or
Yeah,
3 times.
you can get, looks like on average about.
But I will send you the PowerPoint too when it's done.
70%,
Better
75%
yields.
better.
Yeah, because that's what I heard one time. The difference between somebody doing it, if you don't use any pesticides at all, you're gonna get 70% of what you would if you use pesticides.
gotta be
Yeah, so
more-
that's what that
Or
dashed line
fertilizers
is
or whatever.
saying.
There's
Yeah,
gotta be more rot and waste
More insect
and
damage.
insect.
Yeah.
and-
I read some research once that talked about how people are opposed to BT crops, so you can't use transgenic crops, right? Transgenic is the technically correct term for GMOs. Okay, so you can't use transgenic crops in organic production systems. But here's the thing. So take, for example, a low input farm in Central America where they depend on corn for their production. Well, as you approach the time of harvest, corn can be susceptible to attack by insects, which is one of the reasons why we have transgenic crops, is to prevent insect infestations in the crop. Well, those insect infestations are also connected to an increase in some fungal diseases caused by fungi.
Mhm.
And those diseases actually produce toxins in the corn plant. So the statement was, as a result of rejecting transgenic crops, we've made this corn plant more susceptible to disease, and we've put women and children at risk because now
it's
they're going to
toxic.
be negatively impacted by the toxins that disease is associated with. So it's not just cut and dry. There's 2 sides to everything.
So, like, are more like drought resistant? Like, don't they?
attempt to make crops more drought resistant, and not technically a GMO, that's not a bad thing for, like, everyone just hears GMO and they're just like shut down, that sounds tampered with, but it's like, you have to tamper with things sometimes to make it sustainable.
So here's the thing, you guys, we have been, this is why I don't like genetically modified. We have been genetically modifying crops
Right.
from the first day, the first woman 10,000 years ago picked a wheat plant and brought it back home and stuck the extra seeds in a corner and they germinated.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because now it's a different plant. than
now
the
you've
seed got
selected for
wild.
certain characteristics, right? They were selecting for inadvertently selecting for seeds that stayed on the plants because you can't pick seeds up to eat off the ground, right? So we've been genetically modifying crops forever. All we're using now, there's two things. We're using different tools that are more precise, okay? So we can make this transfer happen a little quicker.
Right.
We can control a little bit better what we're inserting. And here's the sticking point. Here's where people have problems with it. Is now we can take genes that encode for a trait that doesn't currently exist in corn, for example. Okay, so the transgenic insect, so it's called BT crops, the insect resistant crops. That gene comes from soil bacteria that live in the soil, okay? You can't breed a bacterium with a corn plant to use conventional breeding to make that transfer of genetic information happen, right? So we package up the sequence of DNA that we want, and now we can stick it in the other plant, so we're more precise. But where people have a problem is that it's not, naturally occurring species. But here's the other thing I'll tell you. There's some evidence that this actually happens in the soil anyway, because bacteria transmit genetic information through these little chunks of DNA called plasmids that like leak out of the cell. So like I could give you my plasmids and you would then absorb part of my genetic material. So they can actually exchange plasmids with plants.
Through the root system.
Through the root
Yeah.
system. So
It's happening.
Is it
just at a
unnatural?
slower rate.
yeah, so is it unnatural? No. Are we doing it using tools that are human derived? Yes, but
I think it's because that we use the term genetic, and when we think of that, we think of like the cloning and the genetic.
I get that
it's
it's a scary
unfamiliar.
sound.
It just
but
sounds
it just
scary. They call it something else.
scary about
Have you
it.
talked about the corn? When they
What about
label it like Frankenfood, you get that idea.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
yeah, and it's marketing. So if you're
Mhm.
cynical, right? There are some folks that will suggest that a lot of this has to do more with pushing back against economics and capitalism, because who's the target for everything? GMO. Monsanto, right? The big red M in St. Louis, Monsanto.
Mhm.
And so people will tell you it's more about getting Monsanto than it is about actually being opposed to heating the planet more efficiently.
Right, because you take a country that's in Africa that hasn't seen rain for 5 years, and, or, a South American, or even in the United States, where they've been in that drought cycle, like someone was saying, you still have to be able to produce food for your.
Even, for example, golden rice, right? Vitamin A deficiency is one of the leading causes of blindness in the developing world and death of children. So we have a rice that produces higher levels of vitamin A. Because it was developed with transgenic techniques, it has had a terrible time being adopted. I've seen where finally Bangladesh has had some successful field trials and they think it's going to be commercialized. And they've accepted some other transgenic technologies, but a lot of people are suffering because they're afraid to embrace something that admittedly does sound a little bit unnatural. It is scary. But dude, you guys, we've been
Yeah, been doing it for a long time.
selecting, and is a mule really a natural thing?
Right.
I mean,
What
so
is that, a horse and a
And a donkey.
and a donkey?
So I would like to bring up that, how many of us have gone through Kansas in the summertime or Iowa and you see all the cornfields? Have you ever noticed the little signs that are along the
Oh,
edges?
yeah.
Okay, it says DeKalb, that's the only name that I can remember now, and then it has a number in underneath it.
Yep.
Okay, you know what that is?
They're crop testing.
Yeah, they're
They're different, there's different, yeah, seed varieties, and what are they? We call them hybrids, right?
Yeah.
They're genetically modified.
Right.
So we've been
Hybrid.
hybridizing things forever, but the term hybridizing doesn't have a negative connotation like genetically modified. And we were like out on vacation one day and it was like it hit me. It's like, this is a GMO. And we would call them hybrids forever. I mean, seriously, I did. I just kind of had one of those crazy random moments. We've been doing it forever and nobody's ever said anything about it because we called it a hybrid. Let's talk about cars. The hybrid cars, that's a positive sounding kind of thing, isn't it?
And if you get the chance to at least just mention Monsanto, if you get the chance, you should at least tour it once in your life, because it is amazing. I've toured it like 3 or 4 times. And I mean, if you get the chance to dismiss some of those ideas about GMOs and hybrids, I mean, it is a really neat experience to go tour.
Their labs and their greenhouses.
So,
And I just saw something the other day, that some testing that had been done by the IARC,
Okay,
which is a subdivision of who?
I don't know IARC.
I forget what it stood for, but that maybe Monsanto isn't as bad as what they thought with the
Glyphosate?
there we go. I was gonna say glyphosate. That they withheld a lot of information, the Europeans did.
Yes, so I've seen some of that information
And
too.
that wasn't fake news, that was real news, because I double checked it.
So, for example, California has reclassified the level of carcinogenicity of glyphosate, which is Roundup.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
We've heard of Roundup
It
Red.
is.
And so the EU is where all of this started. And there's some stories about some of the congressmen that were originally involved, or the politicians rather, that were originally involved in getting this legislation passed to change the carcinogenicity label. So they made it sound more dangerous. They absolutely were withholding it, suppressing
Yeah.
data.
And
as part of it.
so the final kind of, deal was that, while all this was wrong, the true data showed that the people that would be at greatest risk for getting cancer from using glyphosate would be those that applied it, which makes perfect sense.
Right.
Because, you think about, an herbicide, an insecticide, I mean, anything like that that sprays and is going to blow back on you
right.
would be absorbed into your skin, those kinds of things. It had nothing to do with consumption.
Because of the whole idea, we'll look at some slides if we have time about like residues and how long they stay.
Yeah.
Parts per billion, parts per trillion. Is it biologically relevant over a lifetime? Probably not, but yes. I mean,
If you're
I have
breathing
to
it,
admit, I remember seeing my dad bathed in herbicide once and thinking,
He's gonna die.
oh my gosh, he's gonna get cancer. That's a risk, but that's also why the labels all say you should use
Right.
Mask and
Protect-
gloves.
spacesuits and gloves, and
Respirators.
some of them require respirators.
Yeah.
Depends on what they all have different levels of hazard associated with the various routes of entry, oral, thermal,
Yeah.
etc. So yeah, fun. All right. I'm trying, Barry. Here we go.
Tap it.
Tap, move, tap, move, and
Yeah. I don't know, now that they're seeing it, I don't know that this whole thing has been a mess.
I think it's a sensitivity issue.
So I tried hard. I
Little,
tried
like,
slow.
pin or something.
Yeah, is there
No, that won't do it.
nothing
Which one are we on?
manual?
Taylor, any suggestions?
Nope, I'm staying out of it. There's no remote. manual
Right click.
or-
It has to do with my hookup here, and that is,
We have to go up. Down.
no, it's just not working. It's just not working.
We can talk through some more. It's okay. We're cool.
Yeah.
Sweet.
I can't, I'm sorry, I just don't I don't know
We're
what
cool.
else to do.
We're cool.
I am,
How long do you want me to talk at this point?
well, I'm trying to think, you might talk a little bit about, and you guys can get this, where are you anyway? I was trying to find
Down. Down past all that.
okay, good. I mean, I just want us to get as far along as we can today. Oh, let's talk about the Dirty Dozen,
Yeah.
because,
So the one slide sheet we're going to skip over basically says that there are research studies that say that the variety of the plant that you choose is more important than the production system in terms of determining nutritional value. The genetics of the plant have a bigger impact than the environment that you grow the plant in, as far as vitamin content, antioxidant content, things of that nature. So organic food is not
Necessarily.
healthier.
Okay.
Well, I heard, I read someplace that the number of varieties, like at the turn of the century, like the 1900s, the very beginning, today, only less than 2% of those varieties are available. Like in tomatoes, for instance, there's varieties of tomatoes you can't get anymore because they no longer exist. And I don't know if you can, genetically try to reproduce those varieties, or are they gone forever?
Wheat breeders will try to introduce new genetic variation into the breeding program by doing what's called synthetic crosses. So they go back and they try to recreate what happened in nature,
Right.
6,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago.
Right.
So it's theoretically
So
possible, but you're not going to get that exact back. And
Yeah.
so, I just showed a TED Talk in my class yesterday. Jonathan Fowler, and it's all about biodiversity. He's one of the guys who was responsible for the seed vault up in Norway.
Yeah.
And so he gives the example of apples and how 100 years ago, there was an apple variety for just about every family. Corn is the same way in Mexico still, by the way. But those varieties have all been, discarded because they produce less or they have some undesirable trait. So the sad thing is that they might have the genes that we need to have drought tolerance.
Right.
But they were discarded even before, big commercial industrial ag because they didn't have the best traits.
Yeah.
So, all right, Peri, you wanted to talk about
the Dirty,
Dirty Dozen.
just because that sounds,
It sounds exciting. You guys know the Dirty Dozen?
Yeah. The movie.
Wasn't that a movie?
Yeah.
it was
there's
a movie, yeah.
The Environmental Working Group is a pro-organic organization that publishes this list every year of the 12 fruits and vegetables that if you have a limited budget for food, you should buy these 12 fruits and vegetables organic, if at all possible. Does that make sense?
Right.
So like some
Is that
are
because
less
you're eating
likely.
the skin necessarily?
Some of it has to do with, a lot of it has to do with that. So the list, and I'm going to confess right now that this is not the 2017 list. This is an older list, but it doesn't change much from year to year. So apples, peaches, nectarines, I'm going through these fast. Strawberries, grapes, celery, spinach, bell peppers, cucumbers, cherry tomatoes, snap peas, and potatoes. That's the ones on their list. Okay.
Because the skin it absorbs?
Probably it has to do some with the fact that all of those have got the fruit that you see in the store is in that form on the plant that actually gets sprayed. So it's actually coming in contact with pests. That's the one commonality that I can see there. But here's the thing. The USDA goes in and checks fruits, vegetables, meat products for residues
Hey,
of
Rhonda, you're gonna have to mute, please.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
pesticides or veterinary pharmaceuticals, whatever the case may be. They check to make sure that the items that are going to be sold are underneath or below those exposure limits. So that they're below the concentration that the EPA set, okay? So when you go back and you compare the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen list with that data from the FDA, USDA, the only one of those dozen that had any hits as far as being over the limit were strawberries.
Yeah.
I got it.
And like half of those strawberries were imports from Mexico.
Right, where they
Okay.
don't have regulations.
where they don't
Yeah.
have the regulations anyway. So it's a really slick marketing campaign on the part of the environmental working group. And yeah, it's true that these do have higher detection limit or higher numbers of detections than some of the others, but they're all, potentially even orders of magnitude below what the EPA has set as that maximum daily or maximum concentration.
I'm assuming you'll get to this point,
That's okay.
but the only time I ever picked something and ate it straight from the garden was my family's little garden, because we didn't put anything really on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I buy something at the grocery store, and I just imagine all the hands that touched it, and going down the conveyor belts, and the little insects and rats and mice that are not even just the chemicals, but I'm washing that stuff.
Yeah, you are more likely to get some foodborne illness by not washing your fruits and vegetables because of how it was handled than you are pesticides. But even
Well-
that is all closely monitored, and they shut everything down the minute
It
they.
goes through the rinsing cycles. Those
Mhm.
don't mess
But
with it.
some pathogens, they rinse them. Maybe they rinse them with a dilute bleach solution or something like that. But not all pathogens are controlled by that. Leafy greens are particularly bad, right? Cantaloupes, they've got all those little cracks and crevices
Yeah.
You
that
don't
even if you're
penetrate.
rinsing, you may not get every little
But are you
crack.
gonna get sick by eating the inside of it when you're not eating the outside of it?
No, but if you've got the stuff on the outside, let's say, because cantaloupe not too long ago was in the news, wasn't it? With
Mhm.
listeria.
Yeah, there's lots of.
So you take the knife and you cut through, or you peel, then what do? You're going to transfer. You've cross-contaminated, right?
So
Yeah,
unless
that's
you cut and wash and
cut and wash, right?
Okay.
But still, when you cut, you're going to take stuff down with you the first time.
Mhm. Sort of like why it's okay to eat a rare steak but not a rare hamburger.
That's why what?
It's okay to eat a rare steak but not a
Right.
rare hamburger.
Right, right.
Same concept, leafy greens get recalled all the time.
The spinach.
Well, because think about how they're harvesting,
Yeah.
Right.
packaging those. They bring them in from everywhere, all into
They
one
get
central
recalled.
location. Now you don't know where the actual source of the contaminant
Right.
is.
Yeah, and then they
There's
get
stuff.
recalled, I think, for like salmonella,
Yeah, all the time.
I mean.
E. coli,
E.
because
coli.
of improper
Improper handling or birds. Like if you talk to the people
or
who
bathroom
manage
facilities.
health and safety
You
for
know.
like Dole and some of those
Yeah.
companies, positions according to where they position fields according to power lines and trees, because bird droppings are actually probably more likely to cause problems than because they've got the restroom facilities on the trailer with the hand washing stations.
Right.
That's
You can't
easy to
control the
monitor,
birds,
but
just-
you can't control what the birds are doing. So anyway,
Mhm.
that's that story.
All right, I may have to advance, but at least I can advance.
So
Okay.
yeah, we talked about this. This is just showing you most of the samples had no detections and only 38 out of the 10,000s were above the limits. Okay, so then are transgenic crops sustainable? This is just an image of some of the transgenic crops that are available. I stole it from an organic website, but it's a good description of all the different crops you can find. We won't belabor that.
So you have salmon on there. Is that because like if it's a salmon farm, you're getting the nutrients back in the water supply?
So
or
transgenic
recycling?
salmon has got,
It's got a different gene.
I can't remember what the gene source is though, but it makes it basically grow faster and grow better. In confinement's not the word that I want to use, but it's the one I'm gonna use.
Free range salmon.
So in production systems.
Okay.
Okay.
Farm salmon
Yeah,
farms.
Yeah, farms,
farms.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. Do you wanna-
So U.S. milk production before and after transgenic corn. It's difficult to extract health data from humans as far as how does this exposure to transgenic crops affect our health. So a scientist at University of California, Davis, published a study about 3 or 4 years ago now. It got a lot of press, popular press. But what she did is she looked, the most important information is down here in the bottom. She looked at dairy cattle who eat a diet that is largely corn and who, you can measure milk production as a proxy for health, okay? So the first thing you notice is this line goes up, right? We expect production trends to go up because we get better genetics in the cattle or better nutrition management or what have you. The thing to look at is, so before this break before the dashed line, the slope is basically the same as the slope after the dashed line. The angle of that slope doesn't change. So what that's telling us is that those cattle perform similarly. They produced a level of milk similar whether they were eating conventional corn or whether they were eating a diet that was 99.9% transgenic corn. So it didn't, so the takeaway that she's making is that we use this proxy to say that transgenic crops don't affect the health of these, 2 million animals here that we looked at in this study. Okay.
Just a plug for dairy farmers right now. Have you guys noticed a lot of stuff on social media and on the TV and things like that? Because milk prices are so low. I mean, they can't afford to even give milk away. I mean, if they would, they could. And they've got too much invested in their dairy herds and their equipment and stuff. And so there's this big campaign out right now with the dairy industry, well, not the industry, but the farmers, to buy an extra gallon of milk, buy an extra package of cheese, buy an extra pound of butter, whatever, to,
Circulate it.
yes, and to get the prices, because see, it's a supply and demand thing, and right now there's too much, so the prices go down. And so if people buy a little bit, if everybody would just buy one more dairy product, then it would create more of a supply and demand.
And to add to that, you've seen there's been stuff with the suicide rates among the milk farmers.
Yeah.
Because it's like,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I looked it up, and the transgenic salmon that we would, Atlantic salmon, the genes come from the Chinook, the Pacific Chinook.
I thought it was another fish.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
So,
Just to make it hardier and grow faster.
right.
To make it grow better in farm. So,
Oh.
farm salmon is theoretically more sustainable than wild caught salmon,
Yeah.
right?
Right. We're not competing. with the
And
bears.
probably coming soon to a grocery store near you could be transgenic orange juice. There's a disease that has devastated the citrus industry worldwide called citrus greening. It's caused by a little bacterium that's transmitted by a little bug, and it makes trees look like this and produce oranges that you can't use for anything.
Right.
The tree on the other side was a transgenic tree.
Sorry.
So a lot of the
Yeah.
breeders and scientists think that transgenics are the only way we're going to have a citrus industry.
Well, and then especially with the devastation, like the
hurricane.
the hurricane in Florida, and what they had like 2 or 3 kind of up there for a while, and then the freezes.
And they hit the citrus production areas hard.
California.
So here's more about golden rice. I don't think we need to belabor that.
Now,
point.
and I'm going to tell you right now that that's going to be our discussion question
What's that?
about golden rice.
Ooh, fun.
I've never even heard of it.
Well, exactly. Lots of my discussion questions are about things that most people haven't heard about, and so it makes you get in and read a little bit about it, and then that way, if you ever hear about it, you can have a good argument.
We can probably skip that.
Yeah, this food spending around the world, though, talks about how much that we spend on food related to.
Or income.
Well, that's what I was thinking, with organic is always so much higher.
Yes.
People that we're talking about
Yeah,
would
can't
never be able to
Yeah.
afford it anyway.
But sometimes they feel this social pressure, right? I've got babies. I need to buy organic apple juice.
Or I need gluten-free food.
Definitely no, unless you're celiac.
Yeah.
Well, no, because there's some people that actually have a wheat allergy. and
Which
they
is
have to stay
But that's
with
celiac.
Celiac.
They're
People,
not celiac.
no. I will have to argue with that, because the only reason that you need to be gluten-free is if you are diagnosed with celiac disease. That came from my GI person, because I was having GI issues. And the very first thing that they did was do a blood test to knock out everything else, because they said, every person that I talked to, the nurse practitioner, the GI, it's like everybody gets on kicks. It's like, so let's be organic. Let's be celiac free. Let's be keto. Let's do this. I mean, all of these trends come in and everybody falls in on it. Lactose intolerant, everybody went through a time of, I can't have milk because I'm lactose intolerant, because it was the thing to be or the thing to say.
And marketing.
And marketing is a big deal, and everything is way more expensive. So the only true people that need to be on a 100% gluten-free diet are those that have been diagnosed by a physician with celiac disease.
Which is gluten.
Gluten intolerance.
The proteins in your belly don't play nice.
No, they don't play nice.
With the marketing, I've read books that say that, But this is my favorite term for organic. It's just a fashion food label.
So I was reading an article the other day, it's about inconspicuous consumption, right? So among the educated elite, there's this notion that if I can spend exorbitant amounts of money on everyday things that nobody really notices, like food, that's a status symbol. So one of the examples that this article was giving was that, people in this category will have super fancy decked out master bathroom suites, whereas people who have less money to spend are going to have a big pool with a big deck and a hot tub. So conspicuous versus inconspicuous. And so it becomes a club that buying this stuff makes me a member of the club that I want to be in.
Fashion food.
Yeah.
That's all it is, fashion food.
And so people feel all this pressure because of the marketing, but our food is safe.
Yeah.
It's not any more or less healthy based on how it was grown.
And it's
So rare,
abundant.
possibly.
I had a friend that her husband was stationed in Belgium, I think, and socialist government, and when, the last election went through and all this, there was a lot of, people that, were thinking we needed to go to more socialistic. And she was like, and her daughter was one of them. And she was like, don't you remember when we were in Belgium and we went to the store and there was nothing on the shelves? If you didn't get there first thing in the morning, that kind of a deal. I mean, to a local market kind of deal. But we have abundant food. We may not be able to afford it, for all sorts of reasons, but we do have an abundant supply. So here's a world hunger map that I think bears looking at.
And the thing I want to point out is pay attention to kind of the red and orange spots on this map, guys. And then go to the next one.
Okay, so the red and orange, just for those that can't see, would be India. These would definitely be third world countries. Mongolia, it's kind of an interesting one there. Chad, a lot of Ethiopia, Madagascar, Bolivia.
So those are the areas that have the highest percentage of their population experiencing
Hunger. And then look where all the population is. Guess what?
A lot of overlap in the red areas on those two maps. So,
And in fact, during whatever environmental issues. are going on,
Right.
especially-
When you're piled high and deep on top of each other, where are you going to plant something?
and
And in India, there's a lot of monsoon.
Right.
Yeah.
currently a drought in southern India that's causing a lot of
Mudslides,
issues.
mudslides.
So,
The population.
so the point for this slide, guys, is just to look at the fact that pretty much most of the developed world flatline as far as population growth. So this is projecting out to 2095. And then Asia is actually projected to experience a decline in population. The one place on the planet where the population is still increasing is Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So everything south of the Saharan Desert. But the good news, when you hear people panic about the population is actually increasing at a decreasing rate.
Increases less each year.
So it's increasing less each year. Another good TED Talk, if you want to watch one, Hans Rosling. He's recently deceased, but he studies population statistics. He's got a couple of TED Talks that are worth watching if you're interested in issues related to population. Rosling is his last name. So he's interesting. He's good, and he makes it make such good sense.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, when we were talking about the dairy and the products and stuff, I just got diagnosed to be allergic to beef.
Yes.
To what?
I cannot, I could not believe, I asked the doctor 3 times. I said beef, because I grew up on beef, in steaks and stuff, and he said, and sure enough, if I eat a steak, I hadn't had one for 2 years, I broke out terribly bad.
Oh my word.
So, I mean, I guess you get allergic to things after a while on some of these foods and stuff.
Who's talking? Who's talking?
This is Rhonda.
Okay, Rhonda. Okay. Yes, my sister-in-law was diagnosed with a beef allergy a long, long time ago, and quite honestly, we laughed because she's a hypochondriac. She is.
Then she's allergic to everything.
Now she's allergic to every cloven
Animal.
Well, there's that tick-borne disease, alpha something.
right, but she's not had a tick bite. But yeah, no, seriously. So yes, there are beef allergies, and you should check There is a type of eosinophilic esophagitis, I think. A lot of people have been misdiagnosed, and it's with beef allergies, and it has to do with how the eosinophils, which is a type of white blood cell, attacks your immune system. And so a lot of times those two things go hand in hand. Because we have a friend who shows Angus cows, and he can't eat his Angus cow because of this kind of weird. Yes.
Esophageal? Is that what the last word was?
I have to look it up. I'll know it when I see it. But yeah, go on and
Okay.
I'll. But yeah, so there's a lot. Yeah, and you can become allergic to anything at any given time.
The immune system is amazing.
Yeah, it is. We ready to go into that? There's.
Yep.
Oh, here we go.
Here's my buddy,
Okay.
Dr. Borlaug.
Thank you.
Here's my buddy, Dr. Borlaug. He is also deceased, but he is the only man on the planet, you guys, to win a Nobel Prize in the field of agriculture.
Yeah.
I show a lot of videos to my class because people are funnier than I am. There's a Penn and Teller clip
Oh, I love the Penn and Teller.
about Borlaug that's pretty good if you're killing time on YouTube. But so Borlaug, he is in support of biotechnology. And he has as much credibility on how to feed our world as any other human can. Okay, so one of the so the last slide was about crops to focus on for increasing the yield gap. So one of the things that he was promoting at the time of his death was looking at increasing some of these alternative crops just to have more diversity. So Borlaug's Nobel Peace Prize in 70, father of the Green Revolution. Basically, wheat, rice, and maize were the main crops that he worked on, and you can see the countries: India, Mexico, Pakistan, and the Philippines.
I remember him when I was in elementary school.
Did you talk about him?
Well, no, I just remember seeing him. He was on some sort of newsletter for children, and he was like on the front part of it, showing a stalk of wheat. And it just basically said the same thing there, that a new hybrid wheat is going to save a lot of people because he improved the I guess the sustainability of that.
So a lot of people argue the sustainability point. We'll talk about
Right.
that.
So I bet you, was it Weekly Reader? Was it the Weekly Reader?
Weekly Reader.
That's what it was.
That's what it was. I
We
can't
used to
remember
get
what it was
weekly
called,
readers.
but he was like on the front page of it.
Sorry, senior moment, young
Yeah.
people.
I was gonna say,
Yeah,
before-
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I don't feel so old. Okay. So he made semi-dwarf varieties. So he took these tall varieties and crossed them with these short varieties from Japan and basically made the kind of wheats that we grow all over the world today. So they were semi-dwarf. The reason he started wheat breeding was to develop wheats that were resistant to some of those rust diseases that we talked about in Mexico. And then because of how he designed his breeding program, they grew everywhere. So he could develop them in Mexico and they grew just fine in India. Yeah, it's sweet. And anyway, science nerd stuff. But so I like to tell people that if Borlaug had just given farmers these new varieties and not help them with improved production practices, it would have been like giving somebody a Ferrari and not giving them the keys.
Or not showing them how to drive.
Or not putting any gas in it or whatever. Because his varieties had greater yield potential, they would only maximize that yield potential, reach that maximum yield potential under higher input systems. And so this is where some folks are like, yeah, was the Green Revolution really a good thing? Because now we're using more fertilizers, we're using more water. I would argue that if you're one of the people that didn't starve to death, you'll probably think it's a pretty good idea. But he also had training programs. So he had a kind of a comprehensive package that made the Green Revolution happen. So we talked about the fact that Africa is still experiencing population growth, but Africa also has not experienced the yield increases that the rest of the world has. So you see they kind of have a double hit there. Okay. And so I think these come up one at a time. I think there's, 6 of them or so. Okay.
That's all that's going to fit on there for now.
So these were the things that Borlaug wanted to work on at the time of his passing to facilitate the second Green Revolution in Africa. So new, different crops that are, more water use efficient, more nutrient use efficient, higher yielding. But, one of the things that he was criticized for with the first Green Revolution was not necessarily focusing on environmental issues. But we have come to recognize that as agricultural producers, we have a burden to do what we do in a way that isn't going to have negative, unintended side effects. So, anyway.
So why is Africa so far behind if it's like the same, like when you think of the India or?
Most of it has to do with social issues.
Okay, so more like in the tribal, what they're used to.
Lack of education system, lack of infrastructure, less government, less stable or less strong governments.
Lots of wars.
Well, I was gonna say probably more independent tribal, not wanting to work with this one over here.
So yeah,
Okay.
lots of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna save this real quick so I can ship it out to everyone.
Yeah, and that TED Talk that I was talking about sustainable ag is the very last slide.
We'll, if I can get everything set up, we'll pull that one up when Philip gets over here. That'd be a good thing for us, for him to sit down and see if everything's going to work right. Because when people come over, it works right for about 2 seconds. So, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, what questions do you guys have?
So what's the outlook for the spring and summer as far as gardening and all that goes?
Well, we need to get drier and warmer. I checked soil temperatures yesterday. To plant corn agronomically, you want a minimum soil temperature of about 50 degrees, and we're not anywhere close. This time last year, there were guys planting corn because it had been so much warmer.
Right.
We need rain.
I saw where somebody planted their potatoes. Aren't you supposed to plant your potatoes on
St.
St.
Patrick's
Patrick's Day? So somebody had done that.
And there's something about the sign of the moon too, if you believe the almanac.
I do.
My dad is old school and swears by it. I had a colleague in one of my last lives who said he was going to challenge some of his students to test the almanac and do it scientifically and see if they were.
Does everybody know about anybody grow up with the almanac? Yeah.
Some good stuff. I mean, it's good stuff.
You wean your calves and things when it's the farthest away from the udder. So you want to wean them when the sign is coming into the head and the shoulders, those kinds of things. If you're weaning a baby, you want it as it's going out the feet. I mean, it's kind of, you can call it old wives' tales or whatever, but I'm going to tell you,
Some of them are tried and true.
we've done it and it works. This because the signs of the moon